There is a curious pattern that repeats itself throughout human history. Again and again, the ideas that eventually transformed civilization were once dismissed as foolish fantasies. They were mocked, rejected, and often ridiculed by people who believed they understood the limits of reality. Looking back, it is easy to smile at those moments. Yet, if we are honest, we may be making the very same mistake today. Imagine living 200 years ago. Stand in a quiet village on a cool evening as the sun disappears beyond the horizon. The sky stretches endlessly above you, untouched except for drifting clouds and the occasional bird soaring effortlessly through the wind. Someone standing beside you quietly says, "One day, ordinary people will fly across oceans in giant metal machines. They will travel faster than sound and cross entire continents before sunset." Most people would have laughed, not because they lacked intelligence, but because the idea violated everything they believed about nature. Birds were born with wings, humans were not. Gravity appeared to be an absolute law that no amount of dreaming could overcome. Flight was not simply difficult, it was considered impossible. History is filled with moments like this. Every generation believes it has finally discovered the true limits of what humanity can accomplish. Every generation eventually discovers that many of those limits were only temporary boundaries created by incomplete knowledge. The remarkable thing is that impossibility rarely announces itself with certainty. It disguises itself as common sense. That is why today's certainties deserve just as much scrutiny as yesterday's. Before we continue this journey through history, science, and the remarkable evolution of human thought, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and follow along for future documentaries exploring the greatest mysteries of our universe, the hidden stories behind scientific breakthroughs, and the ideas that continue to reshape our understanding of reality. If these topics inspire your curiosity, you'll find many more waiting here. Now, let us return to a question that has challenged every generation. How many things do we dismiss today simply because they have never happened before? The story begins not with rockets or astronauts, but with one of humanity's oldest dreams. For thousands of years, people watched birds with quiet envy. Ancient myths told stories of winged gods, magical creatures, and daring inventors who sought to escape the earth. Across civilizations, flight represented freedom, power, and the impossible. Yet every attempt to imitate birds ended in disappointment. Human muscles were too weak, human bones were too heavy. Nature seemed to have drawn a permanent line between the sky and the ground. Many concluded that the dream itself was flawed. What they failed to realize was that they were asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering how humans could become more like birds, they should have been asking how humans could solve the problem in an entirely different way. That single shift in thinking would eventually change the world. But before that happened, another impossible dream began to emerge. If flying across the sky sounded absurd, leaving the earth altogether sounded like pure madness. Even after humanity finally learned to fly, the sky itself revealed another boundary. Airplanes depended on air. Their wings required the atmosphere to generate lift. Above a certain altitude, the familiar rules of flight simply stopped working. Beyond that invisible edge waited an environment that seemed completely hostile to life. No breathable air, no sound, no room for even the smallest mistake. The idea of traveling into space appeared even more unrealistic than the dream of flight had centuries earlier. People asked reasonable questions. How could anyone survive such a journey? How could a machine escape the tremendous pull of Earth's gravity? Why would anyone even attempt it? These questions sounded sensible because they reflected everything people understood at the time. Yet, history has repeatedly shown that reality often extends far beyond the boundaries of current understanding. Every major breakthrough begins with a moment when someone refuses to accept that today's knowledge is complete. That refusal is rarely celebrated in the beginning. It is often criticized. Those who challenge accepted ideas are frequently labeled unrealistic, overly ambitious, or disconnected from reality. Society has a natural tendency to protect familiar beliefs because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Yet progress has always depended on individuals willing to exchange certainty for curiosity. The Wright brothers were not simply building a machine. They were challenging an assumption that had existed for thousands of years. The early rocket engineers were not merely designing larger engines. They were questioning whether Earth itself had to remain humanity's permanent home. Every generation inherits invisible walls built from the confidence of those who came before. Some of those walls are real, many are not. This raises a question that reaches far beyond aviation or space exploration. What if the greatest obstacle is not the physical world, but the way we interpret it? What history suggests that every age mistakes temporary ignorance for permanent truth. What seems impossible is often nothing more than a mystery waiting for the right question. That does not mean every dream will become reality. Nature still has laws that cannot simply be ignored. Gravity exists. Energy has limits. Physics does not bend to human optimism. But history also teaches another lesson. There is an enormous difference between something being impossible because the universe forbids it and something appearing impossible because we have not yet discovered how it works. For centuries, those two ideas were treated as the same. They are not. That distinction has carried humanity from caves to cities, from wooden ships to jet aircraft, from the first campfires to robotic explorers traveling billions of miles through deep space. Each step began with someone looking at an accepted limitation and asking a simple but dangerous question. What if everyone is wrong? Perhaps that is the most valuable question any civilization can ask, because the future rarely arrives by announcing itself. Instead, it quietly begins as an idea that almost everyone believes is impossible. If every age has its own definition of the impossible, then humanity's first and perhaps greatest impossible dream was remarkably simple: to leave the ground. It sounds almost trivial today. We board airplanes without giving much thought to the miracle taking place beneath our feet. Children grow up watching aircraft cross the sky every day. Flight has become so ordinary that we rarely stop to appreciate what it truly represents. But for almost all of human history, the Earth held us with absolute authority. Gravity was not merely a scientific concept. It was an invisible prison that shaped every civilization, every journey, and every dream. Every road, every empire, every trade route existed because humans could only travel across the surface of the world. Mountains blocked progress. Oceans divided continents. Distance dictated the rise and fall of kingdoms. The sky belonged to something else. It belonged to birds. Every child who ever looked upward shared the same quiet question: why them, and not us? Nature seemed to offer a painfully obvious answer. Birds possessed hollow bones, lightweight bodies, powerful chest muscles, and wings carefully refined through millions of years of evolution. Human beings possessed none of these advantages. We were heavy, fragile, and hopelessly bound to the ground. Every observation appeared to reinforce the same conclusion. Humans were simply not designed to fly. It was an argument so convincing that few people bothered to challenge it. Throughout history, countless inventors tried to imitate birds. Some built enormous feathered wings. Others jumped from towers, cliffs, or rooftops, believing that enough courage might overcome nature itself. Almost every attempt ended the same way, with broken bones, public humiliation, or death. Each failure strengthened society's confidence. You see, people would say, it cannot be done. This is how impossible ideas often die, not because they have been fully explored, but because repeated failure convinces everyone that no other solution exists. The true barrier was never gravity alone. It was imagination trapped inside familiar assumptions. Human beings believed they had only one option: become more like birds. No one stopped to ask whether birds were the wrong example entirely. This pattern extends far beyond flight. Again and again, civilization tries to solve new problems by copying old solutions. We instinctively imitate what already exists because it feels safe. Yet history repeatedly rewards those who stop imitating and begin rethinking the question itself. The greatest revolutions rarely come from improving existing ideas. They come from abandoning the assumptions beneath them. Imagine standing among scholars several hundred years ago. You announce that one day people will cross the Atlantic Ocean in less than 8 hours. They would likely dismiss you immediately. Their calculations would not even be wrong. Based on the transportation available to them, such a journey truly was impossible. Their mistake was not mathematics. Their mistake was assuming tomorrow would use today's technology. This is one of the most persistent illusions in human thinking. We often confuse the limits of our current tools with the limits of reality itself. Every generation does it. Perhaps we still do. Consider how often we hear phrases like these today. This will never happen. The laws of nature won't allow it. We've already reached the limit. Sometimes those statements are correct. Sometimes they are astonishingly premature. Before the first successful airplane, there were respected scientists, engineers, and intellectuals who sincerely believed powered flight would never become practical. Their skepticism was understandable. Every experiment they had seen appeared to confirm their doubts. Evidence seemed to support them, until it didn't. That sudden shift is one of history's most fascinating moments. An impossible idea rarely becomes possible gradually in the public imagination. Instead, it appears to transform almost overnight. One day people laugh. The next day newspapers report success. Within a generation, the impossible has become ordinary. Yet that transformation is never truly sudden. Hidden beneath every breakthrough are decades of quiet failures that history barely remembers. The public remembers the first success. It forgets the thousands of unsuccessful attempts that made success inevitable. Perhaps this reveals something important about human progress. Failure is not always evidence that an idea is wrong. Sometimes failure is simply the price of discovering the right approach. The challenge, of course, is knowing the difference. Some dreams deserve to be abandoned. Others deserve another attempt from a completely different direction. The difficulty lies in recognizing which is which. This uncertainty has always frightened societies. Communities naturally reward stability. They depend upon shared beliefs to function. When someone questions those beliefs, it can feel like an attack on common sense itself. That is why pioneers are so often misunderstood. Not because they are always right, but because they force everyone else to confront uncomfortable uncertainty. Imagine telling your neighbors that humans would someday build machines capable of carrying hundreds of passengers through storms at nearly the speed of sound. Imagine describing airports, international travel, or satellites circling the Earth. Without evidence, such claims would sound indistinguishable from fantasy. Yet every modern airport quietly proves that yesterday's fantasy became today's infrastructure. Perhaps the most remarkable lesson is not that humanity eventually learned to fly. It is that gravity itself never changed. The atmosphere never changed. The laws of physics never changed. Only human understanding changed. The obstacle had always been real, but our interpretation of that obstacle had been incomplete. That distinction matters. Nature was never forbidding flight. Nature was simply waiting for humanity to understand its rules. There is an important difference between breaking the laws of physics and learning how to work with them. Birds overcame gravity one way, humans would eventually overcome it another. The universe had never insisted there was only one solution. We had. And perhaps that is the deeper lesson hidden inside humanity's oldest dream. The greatest prison is not always built from steel or stone. Sometimes it is built from unquestioned assumptions. Every civilization inherits ideas so familiar that they become invisible. They are accepted without examination simply because everyone agrees they are true. Most deserve that confidence, some do not. Progress begins the moment someone asks a dangerous question. What if the accepted answer is incomplete? That single question has launched every scientific revolution worth remembering. Soon, two ordinary bicycle mechanics would ask exactly that question. They would not possess vast fortunes, political influence, or prestigious academic titles. What they possessed instead was something history has repeatedly shown to be even more powerful. They were willing to believe that the impossible might simply be misunderstood. By the end of the 19th century, humanity had spent thousands of years dreaming about flight, and thousands of years failing to achieve it. The dream itself had never disappeared. What changed was the growing realization that perhaps the problem had never been courage. It had never been determination. It had never even been gravity. Perhaps humanity had simply been asking the wrong questions. While much of the world still viewed powered flight as an entertaining fantasy, two brothers from Dayton, Ohio, quietly approached the challenge from a completely different perspective. Wilbur and Orville Wright were not famous scientists. They were not wealthy industrialists. They were bicycle mechanics. At first glance, nothing about their profession suggested they would reshape the future of civilization. Yet perhaps that was precisely their advantage. They were accustomed to solving practical engineering problems. Every bicycle demanded an understanding of balance, stability, steering, and mechanical efficiency. Every repair reinforced a simple truth: success depended less on brute force than on mastering subtle control. Most inventors before them had focused on one question: how can we build a machine powerful enough to fly? The Wright brothers believed another question mattered even more. How do you control a flying machine once it leaves the ground? It was an insight so simple that many overlooked it. A machine capable of lifting into the air for a few seconds meant little if it immediately lost balance and crashed. The real challenge was not leaving the earth. It was staying in the sky. For years, the brothers worked quietly. There were no cheering crowds, no television cameras, no governments funding billion-dollar research programs. Instead, there were workshops filled with wooden frames, canvas wings, gears, wires, calculations, and endless experiments. Failure became part of their daily routine. Each unsuccessful test revealed another flaw. Each broken wing exposed another misunderstanding. Each setback became another lesson. Unlike those who viewed failure as proof that flight was impossible, the Wright brothers interpreted failure differently. Every mistake contained information. Every crash answered a question. Gradually, hundreds of small improvements began replacing impossible dreams with measurable engineering. One innovation followed another. They studied the shape of bird wings, but they did not try to copy birds exactly. They built their own wind tunnel to test hundreds of wing designs. Rather than relying on assumptions, they developed a revolutionary system that allowed the aircraft to roll, pitch, and yaw under the pilot's control. Today, these concepts are fundamental to aviation. At the time, they represented entirely new ways of thinking. Then came December 17, 1903. The location was Kill Devil Hills, near Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. There were no massive crowds waiting to witness history. Only a handful of observers stood in the cold coastal wind as the small aircraft rested on its launching rail. The machine itself looked almost fragile. Its wooden frame seemed too delicate. Its fabric wings appeared almost temporary. The engine produced only modest power compared to modern standards. Nothing about it suggested that civilization was about to change forever. When the engine roared to life, uncertainty filled the air. No one knew whether the machine would rise. No one knew whether it would immediately collapse. For a brief moment, history balanced on the edge between success and another forgotten failure. Then something extraordinary happened. The aircraft lifted from the ground, not gracefully, not dramatically, not for very long. The first powered flight lasted only 12 seconds. The aircraft traveled just 120 feet, roughly the length of a modern passenger jet. By today's standards, it was almost insignificant. A child riding a bicycle could travel farther in less time. If someone had blinked, they might have missed the entire event. Yet those 12 seconds quietly divided human history into two different eras. Before that morning, powered human flight belonged to mythology and speculation. After that morning, it belonged to engineering. That distinction changed everything. The achievement was so modest that many newspapers barely noticed. Some journalists dismissed the reports altogether. Others considered the claims exaggerated. Across much of the world, people continued living exactly as they had the day before. History rarely announces its turning points with fireworks. Often they arrive almost unnoticed. Only later do we realize that an ordinary morning became the beginning of a completely new age. What made the Wright brothers' accomplishment extraordinary was not the distance they traveled, it was the question they permanently answered. No longer did humanity ask, "Can humans fly?" That question had been settled. Every question afterward became different. How can airplanes fly farther? How can they fly faster? How can they carry more people? How can they cross oceans? How can they reach higher altitudes? Once impossibility disappeared, improvement took its place. That is one of the most fascinating patterns in technological history. The first breakthrough is almost never impressive compared to what follows. The first automobile was painfully slow. The first computer filled entire rooms while possessing less computing power than today's smartphones. The first powered airplane remained airborne for only seconds. Yet none of these inventions needed to be perfect. They needed only to prove that the impossible had become possible. From that point forward, progress accelerated with astonishing speed. Within only a few decades, aircraft crossed continents, then oceans, then the sound barrier itself. Commercial aviation transformed global trade, diplomacy, tourism, and warfare. Families separated by thousands of miles could suddenly visit one another in hours rather than weeks. Entire economies became interconnected through the ability to move people and goods across the planet with unprecedented speed. All of it traced back to 12 fragile seconds above a sandy field. That is the remarkable power of the first successful step. It does not need to accomplish everything. It only needs to prove that the path exists. Yet perhaps the greatest lesson from Kitty Hawk reaches beyond aviation. The Wright brothers did not defeat gravity. Gravity remained exactly as powerful on December 18 as it had been on December 16. The laws of physics never changed. Nature never rewrote its rules. Only human understanding evolved. The barrier had never been the universe itself. It had been humanity's incomplete understanding of how the universe worked. That realization carries an even deeper implication. If one of civilization's oldest impossibilities could disappear almost overnight once the right principles were discovered, how many of today's impossible ideas are waiting for the same moment? As remarkable as powered flight was, however, it revealed something unexpected. The sky, the destination humanity had dreamed about for thousands of years, was not the final frontier after all. It was only the first one. Beyond the clouds waited another challenge, far greater than anything the Wright brothers could have imagined. Learning to fly had been only the beginning. The next question would be far more ambitious. Could humanity one day leave the Earth itself? The success of the Wright brothers answered one question, but almost immediately it raised another. If humanity could conquer the sky, what lay beyond it? For thousands of years, people had looked upward and imagined the heavens as the ultimate destination. Reaching the clouds had seemed impossible enough. Yet, as airplanes climbed higher and higher during the early decades of the 20th century, pilots made an unexpected discovery. The sky had an edge. The higher an aircraft climbed, the thinner the atmosphere became. Engines struggled for oxygen. Wings lost the air they depended on to generate lift. Temperatures dropped to deadly extremes, while the human body itself began to fail without pressurized cabins and supplemental oxygen. Every kilometer upward revealed a simple truth. Airplanes were never meant to leave Earth. They belonged to the atmosphere. Beyond that thin blanket of air stretched an environment unlike anything humanity had ever experienced. There was no oxygen to breathe, no air to carry sound, no pressure to protect the human body, and no wings capable of producing lift. The dream of flight had not ended. It had simply reached another wall. Once again, humanity faced a question that sounded absurd. Could we leave the Earth entirely? To many people, the answer was obvious. Of course not. Escaping Earth's gravity sounded even more ridiculous than flying had only a generation earlier. After all, gravity had already proven itself to be an unforgiving force. Even airplanes remained prisoners of the planet, constantly fighting to stay aloft before inevitably returning to the ground. How could any machine hope to break free from something that held oceans, mountains, and the moon in their endless cosmic dance? The challenge seemed impossible because it demanded an entirely different way of thinking. The airplane solved one problem. Leaving Earth required solving another. The Wright brothers had discovered how to move through the atmosphere. Space exploration required escaping it altogether. This was not simply a larger version of aviation. It was an entirely new branch of engineering. The familiar image of graceful wings slicing through the sky would become almost useless beyond the atmosphere. In space, wings offered no advantage because there was no air to push against. Propellers became meaningless. Aerodynamics ceased to matter. Everything had to be reinvented. Instead of relying on lift, engineers turned their attention to pure thrust. Instead of gliding through the air, a spacecraft would have to force itself upward with unimaginable power, carrying both its fuel and its oxygen from the moment it left the launch pad. That realization gave birth to one of the most extraordinary machines humanity has ever created. The rocket. Unlike an airplane, a rocket does not depend on the atmosphere. It creates its own explosive force, throwing hot gases downward with such tremendous speed that the vehicle is pushed upward in accordance with Newton's third law of motion. Every action produces an equal and opposite reaction. The principle itself is elegantly simple. The engineering behind it is anything but. Every kilogram of fuel added to increase thrust also adds weight that requires even more fuel to lift. Engineers quickly discovered they were trapped in a relentless mathematical struggle known today as the tyranny of the rocket equation. Building a larger rocket was not enough. Every design decision became a delicate balance between weight, fuel, power, and structural integrity. A single mistake could mean catastrophe. Unlike an airplane, which often has opportunities to recover from mechanical problems, a rocket offers almost no second chances. Its engines burn with temperatures hot enough to melt steel. Its fuel is astonishingly volatile. Its launch generates forces so violent that even the smallest flaw can trigger disaster within seconds. To ride a rocket is, in many ways, to sit atop a carefully controlled explosion. Understandably, many people questioned whether such machines would ever become practical. Early rocket tests often reinforced their skepticism. Engines exploded, launches failed, vehicles veered off course or collapsed back onto their launch pads in spectacular fireballs. Each failure became public evidence that perhaps humanity had reached a genuine limit after all. Critics argued that space travel belonged in novels rather than laboratories. The dream seemed reckless. The expense appeared unimaginable. The risks were undeniable. Yet beneath every dramatic failure lay something remarkably familiar: knowledge. Just as the Wright brothers had learned from broken wings and failed gliders, rocket engineers learned from twisted metal and shattered launch vehicles. Every unsuccessful mission revealed weaknesses that could be corrected. Every explosion eliminated one more unknown from an extraordinarily difficult equation. History was repeating its favorite lesson. Failure was not stopping progress. Failure was creating it. Throughout the mid-20th century, engineers around the world refined engines, guidance systems, materials, and navigation with relentless determination. Progress was often measured not in spectacular victories, but in tiny improvements: an engine that burned a little longer, a structure that survived slightly greater stress, a guidance system that drifted a little less. To the public, these advances seemed insignificant. To the engineers, they represented another step toward the impossible. Then the world entered an era unlike any before: the space race. What began as scientific ambition soon became a contest between nations. Driven by politics, ideology, and national pride, governments invested enormous resources into technologies that only a few decades earlier had been dismissed as fantasy. Suddenly, Rockets were no longer experimental curiosities. They became symbols of technological supremacy. Each successful launch pushed humanity closer to a moment that had existed only in myths throughout history. For the first time, leaving Earth no longer seemed like an impossible dream. It became an engineering objective. Yet one enormous challenge still remained. Launching a machine into space was one achievement. Sending human beings aboard that machine was something altogether different. A spacecraft could be rebuilt. Human lives could not. The slightest error in trajectory, life support systems, or re-entry calculations could transform a historic mission into tragedy. Every astronaut understood that they were stepping into an environment where there was no rescue, no emergency landing, and almost no margin for error. Still, volunteers continued to come forward, not because success was guaranteed, but because history has always belonged to those willing to explore beyond the edge of certainty. The first powered flight had lasted only 12 seconds. Now humanity stood on the verge of attempting something infinitely more daring, not merely crossing the sky, but leaving the world that had been our only home for hundreds of thousands of years. The next step would carry human beings beyond the atmosphere, beyond the blue horizon, and into the silent darkness that had watched over every civilization since the beginning of time. For the first time in history, Earth itself was about to become the place we looked back at, rather than the place we looked up from. For thousands of years, the moon had been little more than a distant companion in the night sky. It illuminated ancient roads, guided sailors across dark oceans, inspired poets, and became woven into the myths of nearly every civilization. People gazed upward and imagined kingdoms, gods, mysterious creatures, and hidden worlds upon its silent surface. But no one had ever stood there. The moon belonged to imagination. At least, that was what humanity believed. Then, in less than 7 decades after the Wright brothers first lifted a fragile machine into the air for 12 unforgettable seconds, another generation prepared to attempt something even more extraordinary. Not simply to fly, not merely to leave Earth, but to land on another world. Even today, it is difficult to appreciate just how unbelievable that idea sounded during the early years of the space age. Imagine explaining it to someone living in 1903, the same year the first airplane left the ground. You would tell them that before the century ended, human beings would build machines taller than skyscrapers, launch themselves hundreds of thousands of kilometers through empty space, land on the moon, walk across its surface, and safely return home. Most would assume you had confused science with fantasy, yet history has a remarkable habit of transforming fantasy into engineering. The Apollo program was not simply another technological project. It represented one of the most ambitious engineering efforts ever attempted by our species. More than 400,000 scientists, engineers, technicians, machinists, mathematicians, programmers, and support personnel contributed to a single objective that had never before been attempted. Every component had to function almost perfectly. Every calculation mattered. Every gram of weight had consequences. Unlike an ordinary journey, there could be no roadside repairs. There were no rescue stations waiting between Earth and the Moon. Once the Saturn V rocket left the launch pad, the crew would be committed to a journey unlike any in human history. The rocket itself seemed almost impossible. Standing over 110 meters tall, the Saturn V generated a level of power that had never before been harnessed for peaceful exploration. At launch, its 5 enormous engines consumed propellant at a staggering rate, producing millions of pounds of thrust as the vehicle slowly climbed away from Earth. The launch was not graceful, it was violent. The ground shook, windows rattled for kilometers. The brilliant exhaust transformed night into daylight beneath the rocket. For those watching from below, it appeared as though humanity was forcing its way out of the very grip of the planet. Yet escaping Earth's gravity was only the beginning. Once the spacecraft reached orbit, another challenge emerged. Everything that followed had to unfold with astonishing precision. The spacecraft had to accelerate at exactly the right moment, to leave Earth's orbit. It had to travel through nearly 384,000 kilometers of empty space while maintaining the proper trajectory. Even a tiny navigational error could grow into hundreds of kilometers by the time the spacecraft reached the moon. There would be no opportunity to simply try again. Space does not forgive careless mistakes. As Earth gradually shrank behind them, the astronauts experienced something no human beings had ever witnessed before. For the first time, home became a distant object suspended in darkness. The continents no longer appeared divided by political borders. The oceans showed no national ownership. The conflicts that dominated human history disappeared from view. Against the vast blackness of space, Earth looked astonishingly small, fragile, beautiful, alone. Many astronauts later described this perspective as life-changing. Some called it the overview effect. Looking back at our planet from space transformed their understanding of humanity itself. From such a distance, there were no separate nations, only one world, one civilization, one remarkably delicate home, floating through an unimaginably vast universe. Days later, the spacecraft entered lunar orbit. Then came perhaps the most dangerous phase of the entire mission. The lunar module separated from the command module, carrying Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin toward the moon's surface while Michael Collins remained in orbit above. From that moment forward, there was no guarantee they would return. Every descent required continuous calculations. Fuel reserves were limited. The landing site proved far more hazardous than expected. Large boulders and dangerous craters forced Armstrong to manually guide the spacecraft beyond the planned landing area. Meanwhile, fuel supplies continued to fall. Mission Control watched anxiously. 30 seconds of fuel remained, then 20. Every second increased the possibility that history's greatest exploration would end in disaster. Finally, a calm voice broke the silence. "Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed." Those simple words instantly became part of human history. For the first time since our species emerged hundreds of thousands of years earlier, human beings had successfully arrived on another celestial body. But the world was still waiting for the moment that would define an entire generation. Hours later, the hatch opened. Neil Armstrong slowly descended the ladder. Below him stretched an untouched landscape that had remained unchanged for billions of years. No footsteps, no cities, no signs of life, only dust, silence, and sunlight. As his boot pressed gently into the lunar soil, humanity crossed an invisible boundary that had existed since the beginning of civilization. One small step onto the moon represented something far larger than the achievement of a single astronaut or a single nation. It represented proof that the human story no longer belonged exclusively to Earth. The famous words that followed captured that realization perfectly. That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind. Whether every syllable was heard exactly as intended mattered far less than the truth behind the statement. Humanity had entered a new chapter. For thousands of years, our ancestors had looked upward and wondered what existed beyond their reach. Now, for the first time, someone was looking back. The footprints left in the lunar dust remain there today. Without wind or flowing water to erase them, they may survive for millions of years. They stand as silent evidence that a species once confined entirely to one small planet found a way to reach another world. Yet, as extraordinary as the moon landing was, it revealed another profound truth. Standing on the moon did not make the universe seem smaller, it made it seem infinitely larger. From the lunar surface, Earth appeared as a small blue sphere hanging in the darkness. Beyond it stretched billions of stars, countless galaxies and distances so immense that even the journey to the moon suddenly seemed modest. Humanity had conquered one impossible dream. In doing so, we discovered an even greater one. If we could reach the moon, could we one day reach the stars themselves? That question would force scientists to confront a challenge unlike gravity, unlike flight, and unlike space travel itself. For ahead lay a barrier that was not built by technology or engineering. It was written into the very fabric of the universe: the speed of light. landing changed humanity forever. For the first time, we had proven that Earth was no longer the absolute boundary of human exploration. A dream that had once belonged to mythology had become a historical event witnessed by hundreds of millions of people around the world. But history has a curious rhythm. Every time humanity breaks through one apparent limit, another immediately appears beyond it. Standing on the moon did not feel like reaching the end of the journey. It felt like arriving at the first milestone. As astronauts looked back toward the Earth, they also looked outward into a universe that suddenly seemed far larger than anyone had imagined. Beyond the moon lay Mars. Beyond Mars stretched the outer planets. Beyond our solar system waited trillions of stars scattered across the Milky Way. And beyond our galaxy existed hundreds of billions of other galaxies, each containing billions of suns of their own. The scale was almost impossible to comprehend. Suddenly, the greatest challenge was no longer escaping Earth's gravity. It was distance. The moon is, on average, about 384,000 kilometers away from Earth. That sounds unimaginably far until you compare it with the rest of the cosmos. Light, the fastest thing known in the universe, reaches the moon in just over 1 second. It reaches the sun in a little more than 8 minutes. To reach Pluto, sunlight travels for more than 5 hours. To reach the nearest star beyond our sun, Proxima Centauri, light itself requires over 4 years. And light never slows down. These numbers reveal a truth that is both beautiful and unsettling. The universe is not merely large, it is staggeringly vast. As our understanding of space expanded during the 20th century, scientists realized that distance itself might become humanity's greatest obstacle. Even if engineers built larger rockets and more reliable spacecraft, another problem refused to disappear. Travel simply took too long. The faster we wished to go, the more difficult the journey became. At first, this seemed like an engineering problem. Build more powerful engines, carry more fuel, design stronger spacecraft. Surely, humanity would solve it, just as we had solved flight. But nature had another lesson waiting. The universe itself appeared to have established a speed limit. That limit is the speed of light. Measured in a vacuum, light travels at approximately 299,792 kilometers every second. In a single heartbeat, a beam of light could circle the Earth more than 7 times. Nothing that humanity has ever built comes remotely close. The fastest spacecraft ever launched travel at only a tiny fraction of that incredible speed. At first glance, it seems reasonable to ask a simple question. Why not build an even faster engine? Why not continue accelerating until we eventually catch up with light itself? For generations, many assumed this would eventually happen. Then Albert Einstein fundamentally changed our understanding of reality. His theory of special relativity revealed something astonishing. The speed of light is not merely very fast. It is fundamentally different from every other speed. According to Einstein's equations, as any object with mass accelerates closer and closer to the speed of light, something unexpected happens. Its energy requirements begin to grow dramatically. Each additional increase in speed demands more energy than the last. As the object approaches the speed of light, the required energy rises toward infinity. Infinity, not an extremely large number, not a technological challenge waiting for future engineers. Infinity, that single word transformed the problem entirely. The limitation was no longer our engines, it was woven into the structure of space-time itself. Imagine pushing a heavy boulder uphill. At first, every step requires effort, but progress is visible. Now imagine that with every meter you climb, the hill becomes steeper. Soon, enormous effort produces only tiny gains. Eventually, despite all your strength, the summit remains forever out of reach. Approaching the speed of light is remarkably similar. No matter how advanced your technology becomes, each improvement delivers smaller and smaller increases in speed while demanding vastly greater amounts of energy. The finish line never arrives. This realization forced scientists to rethink one of humanity's oldest ambitions. Perhaps the universe was telling us something. Perhaps some boundaries are fundamentally different from those we have overcome before. Gravity did not prohibit flight. It merely required understanding. Earth's atmosphere did not forbid space travel. It demanded new engineering. But the speed of light seemed different. This appeared to be a law, rather than a challenge. Naturally, this conclusion generated intense debate. Could Einstein truly be correct? For more than a century, experiment after experiment has confirmed his predictions with astonishing precision. Technologies we use every day, including GPS satellites, must account for relativistic effects to function accurately. Relativity is no longer an abstract theory. It has become one of the most thoroughly tested descriptions of nature ever developed. Yet accepting this reality creates another fascinating question. If no spacecraft carrying human beings can ever reach or exceed the speed of light, does that mean interstellar civilization will forever remain impossible? Would humanity spend eternity confined to one tiny corner of one ordinary galaxy? For some, the answer seemed obvious. Yes, the stars would forever remain beyond our reach. Once again, newspapers, scientists, philosophers, and ordinary people began speaking a familiar sentence: it cannot be done. History had heard those words before. People once believed humans could never fly. They believed no machine could leave Earth. They believed no one would ever walk upon another world. Each certainty eventually collapsed, not because the laws of physics changed, but because human understanding evolved. Does that mean the speed of light will eventually fall as well? Not necessarily. Science is not wishful thinking. It does not discard established laws simply because they are inconvenient. Einstein's theory remains extraordinarily successful precisely because it continues to match observation. But history offers another possibility. Sometimes the solution is not breaking a law. Sometimes it is discovering that we have misunderstood the question. Perhaps humanity has been asking the wrong question once again. Instead of asking, how can we travel faster than light? Maybe we should ask something far stranger. What if we never needed to outrun light in the first place? What if the future of interstellar travel depends not on moving faster through space, but on changing the way space itself behaves? That possibility sounds almost unbelievable, yet it emerges not from fantasy, but from some of the most intriguing ideas ever proposed by modern physics. And once again, history seems ready to repeat its oldest pattern. The next impossible idea may already be waiting for someone brave enough to ask a different question. For more than a century, Einstein's theory has stood as one of the greatest achievements in scientific history. Every experiment has reinforced the same conclusion: nothing with mass can accelerate through space faster than the speed of light. If that statement is true, and all available evidence suggests that it is, then humanity faces a profound question. Does the story end here? Is the universe simply too large for an interstellar civilization ever to exist? At first glance, the answer appears to be yes. Even if we could build a spacecraft capable of traveling at 10% of the speed of light, an achievement far beyond anything humanity has accomplished, it would still require more than 40 years to reach Proxima Centauri, the nearest known star beyond our own sun. 40 years. And that is only the closest star. The center of our own Milky Way galaxy lies roughly 26,000 light-years away. Crossing the galaxy at 10% of light speed would take more than 250,000 years. Other galaxies? They would remain unimaginably beyond reach. By every conventional calculation, the universe appears to have placed civilization inside an enormous cosmic cage. Yet history has taught us something worth remembering. Whenever humanity encounters what appears to be an absolute wall, the next breakthrough rarely comes from pushing harder against it. Instead, it comes from asking whether the wall has been understood correctly. Centuries ago, people believed the only way to fly was to flap artificial wings like birds. The Wright brothers succeeded because they stopped trying to imitate birds. Instead, they understood the physics of lift. Perhaps interstellar travel requires a similar shift in perspective. Perhaps the question has never been how to move a spacecraft faster through space. Perhaps the better question is far stranger. What if space itself could move? It sounds like science fiction. Yet surprisingly, this question emerges directly from Einstein's own theory of general relativity. Unlike the simple image many people carry in their minds, space is not an empty, rigid stage where the universe performs its events. According to modern physics, space and time form a single dynamic fabric known as space-time. This fabric bends, it stretches, it curves. Massive objects like stars and galaxies distort it continuously. Gravity itself is not a mysterious force pulling objects together through invisible strings. Instead, gravity is the result of curved space-time. Planets follow the curves. Light follows the curves. Even time itself changes depending on how space-time is shaped. This realization completely transformed physics, but it also opened the door to extraordinary possibilities. If space-time can bend naturally around stars and black holes, could an advanced civilization learn to shape it intentionally? One of the most famous ideas inspired by this question is the concept of a wormhole. Imagine folding a sheet of paper. Place one finger on opposite corners. Normally, an ant walking across the page must travel the entire distance, but fold the paper so the corners touch. Suddenly, the journey becomes almost instantaneous. The ant did not move faster. The distance itself became shorter. A wormhole proposes something conceptually similar. Instead of traveling across enormous regions of space, two distant points in the universe might be connected through a shortcut in space-time itself. If such structures exist, and that remains one of the great unanswered questions in physics, they could theoretically reduce journeys lasting thousands of years to mere moments. It is a breathtaking idea. Yet, there is a problem. Actually, there are many. No naturally occurring traversable wormhole has ever been observed. The mathematics suggest that keeping one open might require exotic forms of matter with negative energy density, something unlike anything humanity has yet discovered in usable quantities. Even if such matter exists, creating and stabilizing a wormhole could demand energies beyond our current imagination. For now, wormholes remain fascinating mathematical possibilities rather than established engineering projects. Still, history reminds us to be cautious before dismissing difficult ideas simply because they exceed today's technology. Another proposal pushes this line of thinking even further. Instead of shortening the journey, what if the spacecraft never actually moved through space faster than light at all? In 1994, Mexican theoretical physicist Miguel Alcubierre introduced an astonishing mathematical solution to Einstein's field equations. His proposal has since become known as the Alcubierre warp drive. The concept sounds almost impossible. Rather than accelerating a spacecraft beyond the speed of light, the spacecraft would remain inside a bubble of relatively normal space-time. The space in front of the bubble would contract. The space behind it would expand. Instead of the ship racing through the universe, space-time itself would carry the ship forward. An analogy may help. Imagine standing on a moving walkway inside an airport. You are not running unusually fast. The floor beneath you is moving. Now imagine that instead of a walkway, the fabric of the universe itself becomes the moving surface. The spacecraft remains locally at rest, while space carries it across enormous distances. If such a mechanism could ever be built, it would not technically violate Einstein's rule that nothing travels through spacetime faster than light. The spacecraft would obey local physics throughout the journey. It would be spacetime itself doing the traveling. It is one of the most elegant ideas ever proposed in theoretical physics. Unfortunately, elegance does not guarantee practicality. Early calculations suggested that creating such a warp bubble would require an amount of exotic energy comparable to the mass energy of an entire planet, or even larger. More recent theoretical refinements have reduced those estimates dramatically, but the requirements remain unimaginably beyond humanity's present capabilities. There are also unresolved questions about stability, quantum effects, causality, and whether a warp bubble could even be safely created or controlled. In other words, no one knows whether nature ultimately allows such technology. The equations hint at possibility. Reality has not yet answered, and that distinction is essential. Science advances by separating what is mathematically conceivable from what nature actually permits. It is tempting to treat every exciting idea as a prediction of the future. Responsible science demands greater patience. The universe owes us no obligation to make every elegant equation physically achievable. Yet neither should we assume that today's limitations define tomorrow forever. History repeatedly demonstrates that the boundary between imagination and engineering is constantly shifting. The first powered aircraft looked fragile and impractical. The first rockets exploded more often than they succeeded. The first computers filled entire rooms while performing calculations slower than modern wristwatches. Every revolutionary technology spends part of its life looking unrealistic. That does not mean every unrealistic idea becomes reality, but it does remind us that certainty is often the most dangerous assumption in science. Perhaps wormholes will forever remain impossible. Perhaps warp drives will never leave the pages of theoretical physics. Or perhaps future generations will discover entirely different methods that we have not yet imagined. After all, every great leap in history began not with an answer, but with someone daring to ask a question that everyone else believed was impossible. And if history continues to follow its familiar pattern, then humanity's greatest discovery may still lie ahead, not in proving that the universe has no limits, but in learning that we have misunderstood where those limits truly are. If there is one lesson that echoes through every chapter of this journey, it is not that humanity has conquered every limit. It is that humanity has never stopped questioning them. 200 years ago, the impossible was flight. A century ago, it was leaving Earth. Half a century ago, it was walking on the moon. Today, we debate whether we will ever reach another star. Different centuries, different technologies, the same conversation. History has an extraordinary way of repeating itself, not through identical events, but through identical patterns of thought. Every generation inherits a list of things that cannot be done. At first, those limitations appear permanent. They seem obvious, reasonable, even scientifically sound, and often, they are based on the very best knowledge available at the time. Yet knowledge is not a destination, it is a moving horizon. The farther humanity travels, the farther that horizon expands. That is perhaps the greatest irony of science. Every answer creates new questions, every discovery reveals deeper mysteries, every mountain we climb allows us to see another range rising beyond it. Standing on the moon did not make the universe feel smaller. It made it infinitely larger. Understanding relativity did not close the book on physics. It opened entirely new chapters that scientists are still struggling to understand today. Dark matter, dark energy, quantum gravity, black holes, the origin of consciousness, the nature of time itself. Each mystery reminds us that despite centuries of astonishing progress, humanity still understands only a fraction of the universe it inhabits. In many ways, we remain explorers standing on the shoreline of an endless ocean. The difference is that today our maps are better, but the ocean is no smaller. Perhaps the greatest mistake any civilization can make is believing it has reached the end of discovery. History offers no evidence that such a moment has ever existed. Instead, every generation has mistaken temporary understanding for permanent truth. There was a time when crossing an ocean required months of dangerous sailing. Today, millions of people accomplish the journey while watching movies above the clouds. There was a time when speaking to someone on another continent required handwritten letters carried by ships. Today, conversations travel across the planet almost instantly. There was a time when diseases claimed millions of lives because no effective treatments existed. Many of those illnesses have since become preventable or manageable through advances in medicine. None of these achievements appeared suddenly. Each began as a possibility that many intelligent people considered unrealistic. This should not encourage blind optimism. Not every ambitious dream will succeed. Some ideas violate the laws of nature. Others fail because they solve the wrong problem. Science is not about believing everything is possible. It is about discovering, with patience and evidence, what reality truly allows. That distinction matters. Progress depends upon imagination, but lasting progress depends equally upon discipline. Dreams alone never built airplanes. Equations alone never landed astronauts on the moon. Success emerged when imagination and evidence learned to work together. Perhaps that balance will define the next era of exploration as well. One day, humanity may establish permanent settlements beyond Earth. Children may grow up beneath artificial skies on the moon or Mars, looking back toward Earth as the distant world their grandparents once called home. Future generations may harvest resources from asteroids, construct enormous habitats in orbit, or build scientific observatories far beyond anything we can imagine today. Artificial intelligence may explore regions too dangerous for humans. Robotic explorers may travel for centuries between distant stars, carrying the knowledge of an entire civilization. Perhaps one day, our descendants will even discover methods of travel that appear impossible to us now, not because the universe changed, but because their understanding of it became deeper than ours. Or perhaps they will discover that some limits truly cannot be crossed. Even that would not diminish the value of the journey, because exploration has never been measured solely by the destinations we reach. It is measured by the questions we refuse to abandon. There is another possibility that deserves equal attention. As our technology becomes more powerful, the greatest challenge may no longer be reaching distant worlds. It may be deciding who we become while pursuing them. Will future generations remain recognizably human after centuries of genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, cybernetic enhancement, and life in environments far removed from Earth's gravity? Will humanity spread across the stars as one civilization, or evolve into many different versions of itself? These questions extend beyond engineering. They touch philosophy, ethics, identity. For the first time in history, the future of exploration may depend as much upon understanding ourselves as understanding the universe. Perhaps that is the final lesson hidden within every impossible dream. The greatest frontier has never existed only above our heads. It has always existed within our minds. Every civilization inherits invisible boundaries created by its current understanding of reality. Some of those boundaries are genuine. Others exist only until someone asks a better question. The Wright brothers did not defeat gravity. They learned how to work with it. The Apollo astronauts did not conquer space. They learned how to navigate it. Einstein did not eliminate mystery. He revealed how much deeper the mystery truly was. And now the responsibility belongs to us. Not necessarily to become the inventors who build the next revolutionary technology, but to become the generation willing to keep asking the questions that others are afraid to ask. Because every age believes it has found the final boundary. So far, every age has been wrong. Somewhere, perhaps in a university laboratory, a small workshop, a private observatory, or the imagination of a young student looking up at the night sky, another impossible idea may already be taking shape. Today, it may seem unrealistic. Tomorrow, it may become an experiment. One day, it could become history. And perhaps, centuries from now, our descendants will look back on our own limitations the same way we now look back on an age when humanity believed it would never fly. If that day comes, it will not be because the universe became smaller. It will be because human curiosity once again proved larger than the limits we believed surrounded us. The impossible has never been a permanent destination. It has always been a temporary name for the edge of human understanding. And as long as there are people willing to look beyond that edge, the next chapter of our story has already begun.